So this chapter, this is still the same chapter. So in this book, they put all the reproduction together. So we want to talk about the anatomy of the female reproductive system, how eggs are produced, and then ovarian cycle, so what the eggs go through, or what's happening in the ovary, what's happening in the uterus, and the rest of the anatomy. Okay, so the first thing is the primary sex organs are the ovaries. Okay, so remember the primary sex organs produce the gametes. Okay, now the accessory organs are things that help with copulation. Okay, so we have the uterine tubes, which used to be known as the fallopian tubes. Okay, so those are the same thing. Okay, so you can see that here, right, like this, right here. That's the uterine tubes. Okay, the uterus, which is right here. The vagina, which is down here. The clitoris, which is over here. So here's the bladder, okay, and there's the urethra, which that's not part of reproduction, right? The mammary glands are not on this picture, obviously. Okay, so there we go. Here's the cervix. So the uterus. Here's the ovary. Okay, and the little fingers of the ovary. So we'll go over all those parts on bigger pictures. Okay, so ovaries, so typically they're paired, so we have two of them, one on each side. They're oval shaped. So sometimes they say almond shaped. Okay, so they're going to produce the eggs, and then they'll be responsible for producing the female hormones, so estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so the axis for the production of these hormones is got lots of layers, so it's not really straightforward. It's one of the more complicated hormones, I think. Okay, now the ovaries are covered with the tunica albuginea, just like the testes are, and then they have a cortex. So the cortex is kind of the outer edge. I'll show you on the picture, and that's going to produce the gametes. And then the medulla is the middle part, and that's going to be where the vessels are. Okay, so each egg develops in a follicle, and the follicles are filled with fluid. Sometimes they call the fluid like liquor. Okay, and it's kind of like a water balloon is what the follicles are. So the egg is released when the balloon busts. There are numerous ligaments that are going to hold the ovaries in place and kind of anchor them to the uterus. Okay, so if we look here at this picture, okay, so there's the uterus. The vagina's here, and there's the cervix, so the most, I guess, most inferior part of the uterus. Okay, now here are uterine arteries and veins. Okay, there's a ureter. Okay, and there's another ureter. Okay, now you're going to see the mesosalpinx, which is this part of the broad ligament up here. Okay, here's the ovarian ligaments. The ovarian ligaments are going to attach to the ovary. So there's an ovary, and there's an ovary. Okay, now, so that's the ovarian ligament. Okay, so now the ovarian artery, ovarian vein, okay, you're going to come down from above. Okay, and then this suspensory ligament is gonna it's gonna suspend from there. Okay, now the fimbriae are the little fingers of the uterine tube. Okay, and then the infundibulum is this wide part of it, and then it kind of loops around. It's going to connect to the uterus. I think I got it all. All right. So now ovarian follicles. Okay, so the follicles are going to be found within the ovary. Okay, so there's thousands of them within the cortex of the ovary. Okay, and what the follicle is it's the egg with the cells in it that are going to support the oocyte. So they're going to support the egg. Okay, now, what they call the development of the egg is called oogenesis. And the process that the follicles go through is called the ovarian cycle. Okay, so in female reproduction, we're going to have ovarian cycle going on, and that's going to control what's going on in the uterus. Okay, so we have a uterine cycle. So those two things are going to be linked together. Okay, now, when females are born, they're born with primordial follicles. Okay, so at birth, we have about 1.5 million of these. Okay, and then we're going to use them up every month. Okay, so we don't make new ones like males make new sperm. Okay, so once they're gone, they're gone. Once the follicles are gone, they're gone. Okay, now, in the primordial follicles, okay, we have what's called a primary oocyte. So the primary oocyte is stopped after the first mitotic prophase. Okay, so that's where they're hanging out. So they stay that way. Primordial follicles have a single layer of follicle cells around them. So if you look at this picture, these are all primordial follicles. So they have this follicle cells around them, and then they have this primary oocyte, which that's going to develop into the egg. But these are called primordial. So that's what we start out with. And we only have a certain number when we're born. Okay, now, the primary follicle is going to be next. Okay, so the primary follicle, if you look at this picture, okay, has a primary oocyte. Okay, so primary, and then it's going to stop at the first mitotic stage, so it's still there. Okay, and then it's got a more complex follicle around it. Okay, so one or more layers of follicle cells, but we don't call them follicle cells. Once we get to this point, we start calling them granulosa cells. Okay, now these granulosa cells are going to secrete estrogen. Okay, so they're going to secrete estrogen, and then these thecal cells, which are outside of there, are going to influence the production of the estrogen. Okay, so there's the oocyte, there's the granulosa cells, and then here's the thecal cells outside of it. Okay, then moving along. Okay, the secondary follicle still has a primary oocyte. Okay, then it has many layers of granulosa cells, and what it starts to develop is this space called an antrum. Okay, so the antrum is filled with serous fluid that has hormones in it. So it's going to have estrogen and progesterone in it. So I'll put E and P, so estrogen and progesterone in there. And if you look at it, you can see, okay, it's starting to differentiate. So what happens is you have granulosa cells, you have these thecal cells, okay, then you get this space in here, and that's the antrum. There's the follicle and the egg, and the egg is starting to develop a zona pellucida and the corona radiata around it. Okay, the oocyte, eventually what's going to happen is it's going to get forced to the side. This will fill up. This will be the antrum. This will become the antrum. The oocyte gets forced to the side so that it can be released. Okay, and then these are the layers around the egg. So there's a corona radiata is the outside layer, the zona pellucida. Okay, and then the egg is inside there. Okay, now the mature follicle, which they used to call Graafian follicle, it's had different names before. Okay, so this is large. This is the biggest one. Okay, and this is where we're going to release the egg. So it has a secondary oocyte, which stops in metaphase 2. Okay, the antrum is large. It's full of serous fluid, which has progesterone and estrogen in it. Okay, typically only one mature follicle a month develops, and our ovaries alternate. So we either produce one from the right side, okay, or the left side. Okay, so we alternate. If they're trying to harvest your eggs, what they're going to do is they're going to give you follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and they're going to try to cause you to produce more than one mature follicle at a time. Okay, so the ovaries get full of these and really sore, and then they'll go in and they'll harvest the eggs. Okay, so ovulation is when this mature follicle ruptures and releases the oocyte, and this happens because luteinizing hormone goes up, increases. Okay, so after the egg is released, okay, so it'll be pushed off to the side, this tissue in here, there's a lot of it, it's big, so it just can't disappear. So what happens is that becomes what's called the corpus luteum. So that's yellow body. Okay, so basically it's the leftover follicle. So remains of the follicle, it looks yellow. And what happens is this is going to secrete progesterone and estrogen, and it's going to control what's happening in the uterus. Okay, so it's going to support the buildup of the uterine lining. Okay, so if the egg does get fertilized, there is some place for the zygote and the embryo to develop. Okay, now over time, the corpus luteum degenerates or kind of breaks down, right? And it becomes the corpus albicans, which is a white body, and it becomes a scar that's left on the ovary. Okay, so here's a picture that's showing the whole process. So before birth, we have development of oocytes. Okay, and then we make these primordial follicles, and that's what we're going to be born with. Okay, the oocyte still has 46 chromosomes. Okay, now during childhood, the ovaries are inactive. Okay, they have primordial follicles. Some of the primordial follicles go through atresia, so they break down. Okay, they just are kind of wearing out before you even hit puberty. Okay, then once you hit puberty, okay, from puberty to menopause, okay, about 20 primordial follicles mature into primary follicles. Okay, now some of them are going to go and become secondary, but some of them are just going to break down. Okay, now the primary follicle is still in prophase 1. Okay, so it's got 46 chromosomes. Secondary follicle, it's going to stop at meiosis 2. Okay, so if you look, you go from 46 chromosomes, then they divide, okay, and you get 2 of 23. In females, okay, we're putting all of our cytoplasm into one egg. So we end up with a bunch of these polar bodies that we can't use, that we don't need. Okay, so we'll go through divisions, we'll go through 23, okay, and then if it's fertilized, we actually finish mitosis 2, okay, and then we'll develop into a zygote. Here's the egg, okay, and then here's the leftover corpus luteum. So the oocyte is gone, and then the corpus albicans. Okay, so here's the ovarian cycle again. So you can kind of see, maybe. Okay, so here's day 1. Okay, so we got primordial follicle, secondary, primary, secondary, the vesicular follicle, which now they're calling mature follicle. Then you get ovulation. So at about day 14, you get ovulation. Then corpus luteum. Okay, and then the corpus luteum regresses, and you end up with the corpus albicans at 28 days. Okay, now here's how hormones are going to regulate it. Okay, so for most of it, what's happening is gonadotropin releasing hormone is coming down, stimulating the anterior pituitary. Okay, the anterior pituitary is releasing follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Okay, these are going to stimulate the production of and the development of the follicles. Okay, from here, so maturing ovarian follicles secrete inhibin. Okay, so the inhibin's going to inhibit, so we're going to have the red lines going back. Okay, so we're inhibiting at the hypothalamus and at the anterior pituitary, so we don't keep releasing FSH and LH and GnRH if we have these developing. Okay, because that would be, it's negative feedback. So we have this developing, so we can stop it from producing more eggs. Okay, now what happens if we have low levels of estrogen? Then what happens is the estrogen is going to help the follicle develop. Okay, then the follicle produces a huge amount of estrogen, a large threshold amount of estrogen, and that's going to stimulate the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Okay, so they're just putting this in another page. Okay, so when you get to this mature follicle, okay, this comes back and it says, okay, we need a surge of luteinizing hormone. Okay, and luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate ovulation. Okay, so this says we're ready. We're ready. I should have made this green. We're ready. Give us more luteinizing. We're going to release the egg. Okay, so then the egg is released. Okay, the corpus luteum forms because of the luteinizing hormone. Okay, and then the corpus luteum is going to secrete progesterone and estrogen, which will work on the uterus, and those will go back and inhibit the hypothalamus from making more luteinizing hormone until we're ready. Okay, now the uterine tubes. So we're going to work our way down through. So uterine tubes used to be known as fallopian tubes. We say 10 to 12 centimeters long. Okay, we went over the anatomy. Okay, the infundibulum is this funnel-shaped beginning of the uterine tubes. The fimbriae, they're like the fingers that extend and like almost touch the ovary when we ovulate. So they're going to kind of like catch the egg as it's released. So if this is the ovary, okay, they're going to kind of catch the egg. The ampulla is just the wider part. The isthmus is where it narrows. Okay, and then it's going to go down to the uterus. Okay, the mucosa of it is simple ciliated columnar epithelium. So that's going to move the egg to the uterus or the oocyte. And then the muscularis, it's smooth muscle. So there'll be like peristalsis moving the egg. Okay, so the uterus is like, that's the womb. Okay, so it's pear-shaped, thick-walled, smooth muscle. Okay, so the function of it, it's going to support, protect, nourish the embryo, so it forms a vascular connection that's going to develop into the placenta. Okay, so the uterus, the components of the uterus, the fundus is the top part. The body is like the main part. The isthmus is where it's going to narrow, and then the cervix. Okay, the cervical canal was where we're going to connect to the vagina. Okay, so the uterus is kept in place by the muscles of the pelvic floor, the round ligaments, there's some transverse cervical ligaments, and then there's some uterosacral ligaments that kind of keep it all in place. It doesn't always stay in place very well. Okay, so here's the picture. Okay, so there's the fundus. This is the top part. Okay, there's the uterus, the internal os, the cervical canal. Okay, the external os. Those are all part of the cervix. Okay, there's vagina. Transverse cervical ligament is down here. Okay, it's going to anchor it. Uterosacral ligament is going to, whoops, right here, sorry, that's the ureter. Okay, so it anchors it this way, the round ligament. Okay, so it's all kind of in there to try to hold it together. This is a picture from your book. Okay, now, the layers of the uterus. Okay, so perimetrium is the outer layer. Myometrium is the big layer of smooth muscle. And then the endometrium, That's the inner layer. Okay, that's what sloughs off when you're menstruating. So smooth muscle. So endometrium. Okay, so here I have this again. So the perimetrium is the serosa, the outer layer. Myometrium, it's a really, really thick layer of smooth muscle. So if you think about like delivering a baby, how strong that muscle has to be. So the myometrium is very, very strong. The endometrium, it's the mucosa. So that's what's going to slough off. It's essentially simple columnar epithelium, and it's has a layer of lamina propria. It has uterine glands in there. It has two defined layers. So the basal layer is the bottom layer of the endometrium, and then the functional layer is what's actually going to slough off if the egg is not fertilized. Okay, now vagina. So the vagina, 8 to 10 centimeters long. So they say distensible, so stretchable muscular tube. It has an adventitia. The middle is muscularis, and then a mucosa. So it's tilted posteriorly between the rectum and the urethra. The urethra is embedded into the anterior wall of it. Okay, now the menstrual cycle, and I think I'm going to stop here because this is long enough, and then we'll go through this last part.